tell us, what do you think are some of the biggest problems in the education labor market today?
So I think the biggest problem in the education, the single biggest problem in the education labor market today is that it doesn't really function in the same way that you would see a typical labor market function, in the sense that there's, when there are areas where it's really hard to, hire high quality people, that there's an adjustment in terms of compensation, wages go up, more people are drawn into that area. And this ends up showing up in a couple of different ways. I mean, it shows up because there's chronic problems hiring, math and science and special education teachers, keeping those positions staffed. And it definitely shows up in terms of the distribution of teachers and teacher quality. Schools are not all equal in terms of the nature of the job, and it's pretty clear that it's harder to hire into some schools and school districts than it is into others, and that creates some inequities in the way that teachers are distributed across students.
Is there one particular statistic, finding, estimate that jumps to your mind that is particularly problematic?
So I think I don't know that I would say that there's just a single statistic. I would say that the thing that I find most telling is that we're spending a lot of time today talking about teacher shortages, and I actually think that is not a very helpful way of framing the problem, because it actually doesn't get to the root of the issue that I just described. There are not universal shortages. There are difficulties in staffing positions, increased difficulties in staffing positions probably across all kinds of positions, but particular difficulties in staffing positions if there are these hard to fill subjects, or in particular schools. But the statistic that I would go to, or the fact that I would go to, is that these are not new problems. So if you look at a national survey like the Schools and Staffing Survey, and which asks school systems, in what areas do you find it difficult to hire, and what kinds of schools find it difficult to hire, you can go back to the beginning of the survey in the late 80s and 90s, and you see that it's always the same areas, it's always the same kind of schools, high poverty schools, that find it difficult to staff their positions with high quality teachers. And so the thing that I think is telling is that we really, as a policy-making community, have not done enough to ameliorate that problem. Wave after wave of this survey shows the same kind of results.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research on student teaching placements and how that relates to the bigger picture on equitable distribution of teachers?
Sure. And interestingly, when we began that project, I didn't really relate it to the equitable distribution of teachers. Mm-hmm. I didn't think that it had necessarily anything to do with the equitable distribution. But what we found out was that student teaching placements tend to occur in more advantaged schools, and that's probably because a variety of things. One, there's a geographic component. So teacher education programs are likely to be in communities with more advantaged schools, and student teachers are more likely to teach close to their teacher education program. But also because teacher education programs need to negotiate these arrangements with local school systems, and so school systems that have a little bit more breathing room and can create these contracts. Perhaps that's another reason why you see that student teaching tends to take place in more advantaged schools. So what we find is that the schools in which student teaching occurs end up looking very similar to the schools in which teachers get their first jobs. In fact, in this relatively small sample from Washington State, if I'm remembering the statistic correctly, about 17% of student teachers actually get hired into the very same schools in which they did their student teaching. But many more get hired into the same districts, many more end up teaching very close to teacher education program and student teaching placement. So from that perspective, where you do your student teaching may very well matter. Student teachers get familiar with a school, they get familiar with a culture in a school district. Maybe they get comfortable, the district gets to know them. So it's much more likely that a match could be found between the teacher candidate, the teacher applicant at some point, and the employer. And so if we don't see a lot of student teaching occurring in disadvantaged places, it's less likely that those matches are going to occur in disadvantaged places.
Sure, that's a beautiful point. We'll be talking with Kirabu Johnson next week, looking at some of his research on fit and the way teachers fit into organizations. I think that's really important. And the rent-to-own nature of student teaching is a big part of that, being able to give students an exposure. And that's particularly true, something that we face here in Wisconsin, where we have so many rural schools, and we have folks that the student teaching may not take place in rural schools. So they may have grown up in a rural school, but they don't know what it's like to teach there. And the same thing with urban schools. So we have urban academies where people can get experience in an urban context, but we're finding we don't have the opposite sort of scenario where people that grew up in towns and cities and more urbanized areas can try out, get a feel for what it might be like to learn to teach in those rural areas, just to see if they might like it.
Between us, we've got a sample size of 2, but I would say that the situation looks very similar in Washington State. That there are these 20 teacher education programs. There's a little bit of a hole in a part of the state, in sort of the middle of the state, and very little student teaching appears to be going on in that place, and that's some of the rural districts, and those are districts that really have quite a lot of difficulty of hiring new teachers today. So when I'm on panels with superintendents who are talking about the difficulty that they face, I say, hey, do you welcome in student teachers? And oftentimes they say that they do, but it's hard for them to actually get student teachers. So I think we need to rethink this relationship between teacher education program and school district.
What do you hear to your ears as the biggest misconception that we can clear up? How can we help the conversation move forward if we can sort of just get beyond this?
The biggest misconception is a misconception that is implicit in a lot of the discussion, and it's that teachers are generic. That they're generic in terms of the training that they have, that they're generic in terms of the skills that they bring to the classroom and the impacts that they have on students. And I think that the research has made it abundantly clear that teachers are not generic on any of those dimensions. Now, no one says that teachers are generic, but it's the way that we describe the nature of the problem that is implicitly suggesting that they are generic